day that's been laid bare by this coronavirus pandemic spotlights decades of inaction on income inequality, on wealth inequality, and decades of policies where we favored wealthy corporations and big banks over working people. So that's what drew me to basic income, is because, or universal basic income, there is a way to show that, you can work full time, you can work 2 jobs, you can do everything right, and you still don't make enough money to make ends meet. And you shouldn't work full time and work hard and still live in poverty. And I think the point with the task force was to be able to demonstrate that to the vast majority of Chicagoans, that a lot of our neighbors were struggling, and that's why I think it is essential that cash become a part of the social safety net, not just in the United States but abroad as well, because people are poor because they don't have money, right? And blaming them for poverty doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Could you describe your experience on Chicago's task force to study basic income?
So let me tell you a little bit about my background. Before I was an elected official, I studied the connection between disaster and poverty in the United States. So I did research at the University of Chicago. And one of the things that I found was that American public policy is largely undergirded by, and American social welfare policy, I should say, is largely undergirded by this idea that some people deserve more than others. That is, if you are successful, then you probably worked hard, and you deserve everything that comes your way. And on the other side, if you are struggling, or you're not doing well, or you're not making as much money as you need to make ends meet, then perhaps you haven't worked as hard or lifted yourself up by your bootstraps to build a better life for yourself. That narrative of deserving and undeserving is what I wanted to attack and this task force. So let me give you one quick example of what that means. My daughter was born in 2016, and the first time I went to go buy her diapers, they were behind lock and key at the store. So I started asking questions. And what I found out was that if you are on public aid in the United States, you can't buy diapers or sanitary wipes with public aid. But in order to send your child to childcare so you can go to work to put food on the table, you have to send them with diapers and wipes. And so what we found out was lots of parents were put in this really tragic situation of potentially stealing diapers and wipes, which is why the store had locked it up. I say that tell you that story is because the fact that you can't buy diapers or wipes with public aid is how we bake in prejudice into public policy. And what I wanted to demonstrate on that task force was there are a whole litany of public policies in American social welfare, in the social welfare space, where we try to limit people or do the bare minimum because we worry about moral hazard. And in doing so, we make people's lives harder. And so what I tried to, in a long-winded way of saying, I wanted to bring that approach to the task force to say that, look, if we gave people cash, we afford them dignity, we afford them agency to make decisions about what's best for their lives. Does that mean that some people might game the system or use the money in a way that we wouldn't approve of? Sure, that's fine. But that's what dignity and agency does, right? We trust people. And when we don't trust people is how we end up with prejudiced public policy, like I just described with diapers. So that is the approach I brought to the task force, and I tried to reinforce with, the people on the task force were largely civic leaders, right? They're elected officials, heads of businesses, major foundations. So we tried to get them to understand that here are all the pressure points on poor people, and here's what cash can do to make their life easier.
And what were the main conclusions that you reported to the city?
What we found is a large percentage of Chicagoans were living to check. A significant portion of Chicago was burdened by housing costs. Obviously, 1 in 3 could not afford diapers. And that the economy in the city of Chicago had fundamentally changed. So let's zoom back out for a second. When I launched this task force, President Trump and other elected officials were raving day in and day out about how wonderful the economy was, right? We had historically low unemployment. The stock market was performing at levels we hadn't seen before. The Dow had hit 30,000 points, and everyone was celebrating this wonderful economy. But underneath the surface of the economy was this sort of rotten underbelly where people were struggling. And what we saw in this report and what we demonstrated to Chicago was we've had a real shift in Chicago. We've lost a lot of middle income jobs to the service sector. So people are working, they're gainfully employed. We have record low unemployment on the aggregate, but there were lots of neighborhoods in Chicago where unemployment was still persistently high, where redlining and racism and institutional racism had left large numbers of people behind. And so the report showed, sort of held a mirror up to Chicago and said, here's what's actually happening in our communities. And here's what cash can do to lift up working people across the city of Chicago.
What type of policy innovations would you see as feasible at the city level that would be in the spirit of basic income?
There's this famous study from New York about Rikers Island. Rikers Island is this big jail in New York City. And researchers decided to assign prisoners, inmates, with a pin from where they were, a pin for where they were currently, and then drop that pin as to where they were arrested. When they took those pins and dropped them onto a map, what they found was on some blocks in New York City, they were spending millions of dollars to incarcerate people from that block, right? So it costs about $50,000 or $60,000 to incarcerate someone at Rikers Island. So we're spending millions of dollars in communities, in some cases, just to incarcerate people. I say that because most people believe that a basic income is only feasible at a national level. And I think that at a version of a basic income is possible at state and local, meaning city levels of government. I mean, look, in Chicago, we talk about this community to school to prison pipeline, right? A pipeline where young Black and brown boys, and now more girls, are shuttled through a system, a failing system, right into the jails. And so you can trace how much money is spent at the end of the line when it comes to incarcerating an individual. What if we just flipped that on its head and provided a basic income on the front end, right? We know that James Heckman's work, Nobel Prize winning work at the University of Chicago, demonstrated that when you invest in young people early, you see compounded returns over the long run and a reduction of spending in the justice system. So imagine figuring out a way to get cash to parents when their kids are young. Think about the compounding effect that would have on that child's life. So to me, I think, when you think about it, perhaps providing a basic income to all parents of newborns from the time they're born up until age 3, a basic level of support. So I think there are innovative ways to do this, and I think it is certainly feasible at the state and local level. It's just about being willing to look at everywhere where we spend money and thinking about how we realign and redesign our system such that the money is spent where it's needed the most.
I want to follow up a little bit on that. You mentioned children in poverty. Could you speak a little bit about what the role of cash transfers could be in the learning process?
So the Chicago public school system educates about 385,000 children. That's from grades K through 12. 90% of that population is low income, right? That's a lot of young kids. And What we also know is that poverty has health impacts not only on the parents, but also on children. There's trauma that comes with poverty, and there's a cost that gets associated with that. So we see some neighborhoods that are just a few miles apart in Chicago where life expectancies are 20 years. There's a delta of 20 years. In other words, wealthier parts of the city, people are living 20 years longer than their neighbors just a few miles from where they live. That is what poverty does to people. It robs people of years of their life. It has health impacts on their children. Those health impacts impact the one's cognitive development. Though poverty has an impact on the economy in that, people who might have really wonderful ideas or might be future entrepreneurs or scientists or doctors, the poverty robs our economy of that productivity. Every aspect of society is impacted by inattention to childhood poverty and poverty of parents. And we should be thinking about that and investing in mitigating against that poverty.
When it comes to the goal of sustainability specifically, what elements of sustainability do you think could be achieved through something like a basic income?
Yes, so on a basic income, I think the thing about sustainability is, sorry, my daughter just ran in, so you might have just heard her. When you think about sustainability, when you think about, at a very local level, again, bringing up a Chicago example, we want to be able to get people out of their cars. We want to get people onto public transit. We want to be able to align public transit near housing, all of which major cities have struggled to do, especially around affordable housing. Giving people cash, ensuring people have enough money, gives them more choice as to where they can live, ability to live near mass transit, and also the ability to explore other kinds of transit options that are green, that are not available to them currently. I think, the thing about sustainability goals when it comes to cash is that you want people to have built-in resiliency. When you look at this coronavirus pandemic, the thing that I know from my research is that all disasters, pandemics or natural, what they really do is force all the pre-existing conditions in the community to the surface. So that could mean poverty, that could mean pollution, that could mean environmental degradation, that could mean institutional racism, or it's all of those factors. And a lot of the times they stay under the surface when times are good. And people try, often, sadly, not to address those issues. But when there is a disaster or a pandemic, everything comes together at once. And now we're seeing the impacts of decades of inaction on inequality, right? So in Illinois, for example, a large percentage of the people who have died from COVID are Black or brown, right? Poverty is a comorbidity when it comes to this pandemic. So imagine what access to healthcare, access to cash, a reduction of toxic stress, an increase of individual resiliency might do for health outcomes or for preparedness and response during a pandemic. So all to say, for those of us who have some reserves and money and cash, we know what that makes possible for us. I don't know why policymakers can't see the same for people who don't have enough cash. Right? It seems to me that it's a pragmatic and logical solution to make sure people have enough money to make ends meet.
How has the coronavirus affected Chicago specifically, and how do you think the crisis would unfold differently if basic income was already in place?
So, think about it this way. Before the pandemic, I'll go back to my data. Before the pandemic, only 4 in 10 Americans had $400 in the bank for an unexpected expense. 68% of Americans didn't have $1,000 in the bank. So let's play that out practically, right? What does that mean? That now that data point isn't just a data point, it is staring at us in the face, right? People are out of work. They have to make emergency expenditures, whether it's on food or medicine or on shelter, and they probably don't have enough to make those payments. Even if you are working, now remember, those numbers account for historically low unemployment. What's the average insurance deductible if you have to go to the hospital? A lot of the times it's about $1,000. So we know only 4 in 10 people have $400 in the bank. We know that nearly 70% of Americans don't have $1,000 in the bank. So someone is feeling sick, they believe maybe they have COVID or they probably should get tested, but out of fear, and now this is early on in the process, I am sure people decided, I'm not going to go and get tested, or I'm not going to go to the doctor, I'm not going to go to the emergency room because I don't have enough money to make that initial payment. I mean, these are the kinds of work choices that we force people to make. And it's tragic, right? We are the most advanced and wealthiest nation in human history. We've had 160,000 people die because our economy favors wealthy people and protecting wealth over serving working people. So a lot of those deaths were preventable. A lot of the deaths that we'll likely experience in the next few months are also preventable. And cash is a big part of the solution.
So going forward, what do you think the dangers society might face if we don't tackle income inequality?
So when you look at the trend that we see around the world, inward nationalism, a tendency in countries to blame the other. This isn't just white supremacy. I mean, look at India with Prime Minister Modi and Hindu nationalism and targeting minority communities in India. Look at the Philippines, Poland. The United States is just one country in that set where inward nationalism, targeting the other, is accepted now as the norm. But in each one of those countries, there is a long history of inaction on inequality and inequity and of pitting working people against one another. History shows us what happens when we don't take care of people. Democracy is at risk. And what are the options here? We have a president in the United States today that is already predicting that the election might not be legit. I mean, this is how fascists talk. Now, I don't claim, nor do I think that basic income is going to solve all problems. But one of the biggest drivers of inequality today is a lack of cash. If you don't make enough money today, you don't have enough money to save and accumulate some wealth to pass to the next generation, right? That's the American dream, is that you can go to work, you can earn enough to save a little bit, to buy a home, to create some equity and pass a little bit on to the next generation. That's a dream today. It's very much a dream. It's not reality for most people. And when that dream cannot be a reality for most people, it paves the way for inward nationalism and really ugly politics. And that threatens democracy. So to answer your question, if we don't address inequality, we should be prepared for what happens when there is no democracy, because that is the next step. So, in history is usually a good predictor of what might happen in the future. So, all to say, I think we don't have a lot of time to act, but I do believe policymakers around the world are recognizing the need to help working people, and I certainly hope that the U.S. Congress does that in the next few weeks.
Do you have any practical advice for city leaders who are interested in basic income or cash transfers?
Yeah, I mean, look, the research shows that people don't cheat. They don't use the money to buy things that we think they shouldn't be buying. Will there be some percentage of folks who do otherwise? Yeah, of course. But on the whole, cash gives people the ability to make rational choices for themselves. So let me put it this way, go back to disaster. There's this quote from this woman after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, where she said, you know what I don't think people realize about living in my neighborhood in New Orleans is that you have to be rich to be poor. And what she meant by that is, milk costs more in her neighborhood because there aren't grocery stores. So you're paying sometimes double what you would at a grocery store. Her neighborhood didn't have equal access to public transportation, which means she only could shop at certain stores that charged her more. And so when you look at the access to resources that some neighborhoods have, and then you look at what some neighborhoods don't or communities are denied, you can see how some places have more resiliency and others don't. So the practical advice that I have for policymakers is look at the big picture, right? Giving people cash does not reduce work. It doesn't change the fact that people as human beings want to be productive. What it does do is it gives people more choices and the ability to have some dignity, to have a little bit of freedom and breathing room in their lives. That's really what you're creating here. And when people have breathing room and dignity and stability, it's hard to end up with politics that pit people against people or the other. So the practical advice is cash is a stabilizing force. Think about it that way, and then go from there.
Do you have any concluding thoughts of things that we didn't cover?
Yeah, I would say that not only America, but I think most of the world is at an inflection point. What we do in the next 3 to 6 months will determine what happens for the next decade or more. It'll have long-lasting impacts on young people today, probably for the rest of their lives. If we don't make large-scale investments with cash and infrastructure and additions to the social safety net, then the generation that is now experiencing this pandemic will have profound impacts personally, but our economy will also be impacted in the long run. And if you're thinking about this from a dollars and cents perspective, focus on the economy. You want a better economy 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Invest in people today. If you want to take a more human-centric approach, understand that if you invest in people with cash today and provide them the supports they need to get through this pandemic, people will live longer. They'll live healthier and more productive lives, lives of dignity, and lives where communities lean on one another. And if you're willing to look at both perspectives, just understand that giving people a sense of stability doesn't result in the kind of politics we see today. Really, we have a choice to make. That's the inflection point. Are we going to keep repeating the mistakes of the past and allow inequality to fester? Or are we going to reverse course, or change course, as I say, and reimagine the rules?
Great. I think now we will take some questions from the audience. The first one is, if a country or a city is giving money to all of the citizens, the concern is that it will disincentivize individuals from growing professional skills or gaining high-tech knowledge to make them competitive in the workforce. So the question they have is UBI a conflict factor to talent cultivation and sustainable learning?
It's a good question. I mean, we know from probably over 100 studies now that cash is not a disincentive to work, right? Cash is not a disincentive for upward mobility, right? A lot of the perceptions that undergird that idea are rooted in the same constructs that limit social welfare provision, right? And this idea that somehow poor people are deserving of where they are today because they lack some sort of character to make better choices. And so in order to make sure, or in order to prevent moral hazard, we need to do just the bare minimum. That is just perception. It's not rooted in any facts. No study bears out that if you help people that they get addicted to help. So what we've also found is that when you provide people with cash, they do invest in themselves. I believe in Finland, what you saw, where some people claim they saw mixed results with some of their basic income pilots, is that people might have gone to part-time work but invested in themselves by going to college or to get post-secondary training. So it depends on what you're measuring, right? Are you if you're suggesting that you give people a guaranteed income and then you're measuring whether they stay full-time employed for some set period without any breaks, but if they choose to invest in themselves by going to school, if you count that against them, well then, I think you're going to see fluctuations in the data. All to say, I think people make good choices. We have to trust people. That is what's missing in a lot of social welfare policy.
You mentioned Finland. The second question is there any place in the world you would see implementing something like UBI, and has it been successful?
You asked if it hasn't?
So the question is, has it been implemented anywhere, something like UBI, and what were the effects?
So in the United States, we can point to a couple. One pilot in Stockton, California, which was recently completed, and you found profound impacts on people's well-being and their mental health, a reduction of toxic stress, the ability to pay down debt, save for the future. This is all from the Stockton demo in Stockton, California, under Mayor Michael Tubbs. Now, the Alaska Permanent Fund in Alaska is an interesting example because it pays out an annual dividend based on oil revenues. And you've seen some really interesting effects on communities, right? So one interesting one is that divorce rates went up, and that's because lots of women who were in abusive relationships were able to have enough cash to start over somewhere else. You saw higher savings rates, higher spending on higher education attainment. So that's another really interesting example, which is the Alaska Permanent Project. What we also know in the United States is that there's the earned income tax credit. It's not quite the same as a basic income because it's tied to work and it's tied to filing taxes. But it is essentially a cash transfer from the government that's provided annually. And it has been one of the most effective tools at reducing poverty. Of all the various things the U.S. has tried, the earned income tax credit has been one of the most effective tools. And that is a direct cash transfer. So imagine now taking that direct cash transfer, removing work from the requirement, right? Work and dignity don't have to be connected to one another. You should have dignity just simply for being a human being and being a member of society. But imagine if you disconnected those two and you, instead of providing an annual payment, you made it a monthly or quarterly payment. Think about how much more we could reduce poverty in the United States.
The next one, I think, is a couple of questions. The first is, a lot of people are talking about UBI and artificial intelligence and how technology will displace jobs. So if you could comment on that. And then the second part of this is, in the world where you have UBI, what do you think the government's role is in trying to motivate people to continue to work?
So let me answer that second one really quickly. Most of the proposals, Andrew Yang, for example, when he ran for president, talked about $1,000 a month. People aren't leaving their jobs for $1,000 a month. It's $12,000 a year. If you factor in a full-time job of 2,000 hours a year, it's $6 an hour. I mean, if you're making minimum wage in Chicago at $13 an hour or $26,000 a year, you're not going to quit your job because someone's offering you 12. But if you're making $26,000 a year full-time and you've got an extra 12 coming in, now you're at almost $40,000 a year, you're almost at self-sufficiency, meaning you can afford a one-bedroom apartment and not live check to check, not be housing insecure, and save a little bit of money, right? So I haven't seen any examples of any proposals where UBI is proposed at a level where people would have a real trade-off, meaning, like I make X, the UBI is Y, which is just slightly less than X. Maybe at that point I may make a decision about leaving work, but we're talking about a fraction. We're really talking about an income supplement, right? Or an income floor, right? That no matter what happens, you're going to make this much money. I just think, again, we have to ask ourselves why we ask that question. So I always ask people that, which is what makes us ask the question that leads us to believe that people will do something wrong or bad or do less if we help them a little bit. We don't ask those questions when we hand over, or certainly didn't in the United States when we handed over trillions of dollars in aid to big banks and hedge funds. And we know that they've gamed the system. And yet no one asked that question. So I think also a useful exercise in this, and I tried to do this on the task force, was ask the researchers, ask people, why are you asking that question? Unpack why you are where you are. Now, on the first question, do you mind repeating that to me as part of that two-part?
AI.
Oh, AI, yes. Look, I think predictions about the robot apocalypse are probably a bit overblown, but I think there are a lot of jobs that are being replaced. Think about Amazon, for example. They hired 25% less warehouse workers last holiday season than the year before. Some of that is attributable to the automation of their warehouse functions. I think a lot of white-collar professions, like accounting and even the law, legal profession will see some automation. I think these are sort of natural things. Everyone, look, it's sort of sexy to talk about this issue that may feel like off into the future. And about how do we make work pay in the future when there's all this new technology. What I think it's worth reminding people is that work doesn't pay today. That's the problem we should be solving, is that work doesn't work today, which is why we're even talking about a basic income.
All right. I think that wraps it up, Ameya. Thank you so much for sharing with us about the role of basic income in securing dignity. I think we had a really productive conversation today, and I hope that we can continue this conversation. So we actually have an educational panel online tomorrow at 4 p.m., and everyone joining us today, we hope to see you tomorrow. And I will personally see you next Thursday at 10 a.m. in the morning, again on the Talent Circulation Alliance page. We have invited Sean Klein to share with us his perspective on child development in the digital era. So we will see you at the same place and the same time on the Talent Circulation Alliance Facebook page. See you then.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ameya.